Thank you. Thanks, Barbara, for the invitation. Pleasure being here. Thank you, Dave, for agreeing doing this talk. We also only met like a few weeks ago after the invitation to this conversation, which was a big pleasure, learning more about your practice. For you who don't know Dave is an artist based in Brooklyn, New York, originally from Jamaica, studied at Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine, and did a BFA in printmaking at the University of Arts in Philadelphia. But since a couple of years is based in Brooklyn and works as an artist mainly with installation and text and very strongly with performance. The performance itself is also the main topic of this conversation, I would say. So to start, your performances, like if you go back, the earliest work I saw was from 2000, but like we started like also with this work that is on show here, AEIOU. You work with performance as an artist, but then you also perform for the camera. Mm-hmm. So there is a kind of like a negotiation of you as an artist in relation to the camera as a documentation. Yeah. So documenting performance instead of like live performance somehow. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could talk about your relationship to that object, to the camera as a pure form of documentation first.
I can try. So just like thank you for your questions. Thank you for doing this. And thank you for all of you for being here. My sort of tendency, I think, is kind of to talk around things. So just, I don't know, they may or may not kind of like the circle may or may not close itself. Well, I guess the one thing that I wanted to say in terms of my relationship to the camera is really, I think maybe just about like audience. And with so much of my work, the question of sort of like where the audience is really important to me. So even though I have I make objects and I make performances and all sorts of things that are largely kind of like mood and idea dependent, I think I am often trying to negotiate how an artwork is meant to be a kind of like form of living for myself. Like I think the work often answers a kind of question that I'm confronted with. And so within that, when I'm thinking about the camera, I'm also trying to understand like who a viewer might be. And this is again sort of the circle. This is all to say that like I think about where my body is all the time, especially in a black male body. I find that like I'm negotiating how I'm presenting in the world or how I imagine I'm presenting. And the camera has been this, I think, really interesting tool for me where I get to not only participate in that construction, but then try to leverage the fact that I am both in front of and in some strange way behind the camera. So I am doing both the duty of being like subject of that filming and also creator of that filming or of that representation. And within that, there still is a construction that I'm unable to touch. But I think that the performances and my way of being in front of the camera and using the camera as a kind of tool to record the performances is in a lot of ways an attempt to negotiate visibility, right? Like how I'm being seen. And I think a lot of this also starts with a question of like, what would I say? Well, let me go back a little bit. So I studied printmaking in school, and printmaking was a way for me to like escape painting, I think, probably because I thought, like many people studying art, that I was going to be a painter, because that was sort of like a first love, entry point into making art. And then I got to school and I realized that it probably wasn't going to happen. I was just sort of instantly convinced I wouldn't be a good painter. And so I thought, oh my God, like what do I do here? I just don't think that I have it within me to be a really good painter. And I found printmaking, and it was like a really nice balance of, I keep talking, this like really nice balance of kind of image making and line and surface. And while I was in printmaking, it was good for me because it was like a place that I could experiment. Just had a really open department. And within that experimentation, I was just sort of like looking at things, and I felt like I spent a lot of time in the library, just sort of like unraveling, or like looking at other artists' work. And I wasn't even really reading these books, I was just like looking at, like flipping, like image, image, image. And I discovered previous sort of history of performance, and kind of things from like the 70s or even before that. And I was really confronted with just like the image, right? So like a typical example in my brain is the image of like Chris Burden having been shot. And within that, I was like really just sort of mesmerized and kind of blown away with this thing that I was like, how would someone come to the point where they would do this, right? Or have this thing done to them. And that led me to this kind of world of performance where on the one hand I was trying to figure out what performance would mean for me, and also I think trying to recognize that that kind of extreme durational endurance performance was sort of off limits. Like I wasn't gonna have myself shot, right? I wasn't gonna injure myself in quite that way. And so I'm thinking about that, and then also I'm thinking about things that are much more approachable to me, like having grown up, like so many of us, like watching movies and things. And so I think between the static image of Chris Burden or many other artists that I was really interested in, and then like inventing what had happened in this performance that I could not see, cinema, which like I had basic access to, I really began to think about like myself sort of filling in the gaps between those two moments or positions, static image, cinema, and that became this really interesting loop for me where I could record myself performing in a weird way for myself, because I had not yet developed or created an understandable for me possibility for an audience. And so
there was no audience, there was no life for you yet.
I mean, I think I could have gone about it, but I didn't yet know how to do it.
Yeah.
I hadn't seen a performance, right? I was just sort of in between space where like I wanted to do something and I needed to do something, and then the recording of that something allowed me to be the first audience. So this long-winded way of thinking about this is all to say that the thing that the camera does for me really quickly, or one of the things that it does, is allows me to be an audience for me.
Yeah. So just to briefly wrap up what we see in this show at the Gallery, which is the fourth exhibition of Dave with Barbara Wien. There's 7 video pieces now on show, AEIOU and Y.
Yes.
And each of these works was performed live first?
The first
3 were recorded, and then
yes.
you started live streams?
Yes.
So you were in New York in your studio and performed one of the sequences
yes.
live, and people that were at this time in the gallery could see them
right.
live, but you couldn't see them.
Correct.
They only observed you, they watched you somehow. And after that, these videos were played as a recording somehow.
Right.
So just to go back 23 years to the year 2000, when you produced a work that is called Edward and Me.
Yes.
which is a 5-minute video work which shows you standing in front of the entrance of a supermarket, dancing, falling, moving in all kind of forms. So we talked about your relationship to the camera, to the idea of you kind of like documenting yourself, also of being your audience before you actually show it to an audience. What I'm interested in here is also the idea of the function of the camera, because in 2000 it was like there were video cameras around, obviously, but not everyone had a webcam built in their computers or phones and streamed everything continuously live, shared it with the world. So how did for you this kind of like, how did your relationship in that regard change to being your audience, but also to kind of like film you, watching you?
So this video that I made in 2000, there are at least 2 people here who were there when I made it. So I made this at the Galerie School of Painting and Sculpture, and the way that I made this video, which I end up sort of dancing in front of this supermarket store, is that I borrowed a camera from the school and I rode down this very big hill into town. The residency program is just sort of outside of the main part of town. And then I performed, recorded it, brought it back, edited it. And I mention that because even in that like simple journey from like the residency down a hill on a bike into the more like center of town, dance in front of the store, there are enough things within that have changed that really interest me, and also I think just point to even a pretty radical change in technology, right? So I have to like borrow a camera, whereas like now probably there are like, I don't know, 20 cameras in this room, right? Or even the idea for me of the live stream, which is very much what has happened in the last couple of years, especially during the pandemic, right? So this shot that you see of me in my studio, especially when it's front-facing, I guess, is very much my life in the last few years, right? So that shot, this video, it's my studio. It's a place that obviously I'm making some amount of work from, but it's also become this really strange place where it's serving multiple uses. So during the pandemic, I would make work from my studio, I would teach from my studio, and then I would, and still do, I would do like a weekly session of Zoom Pilates, right? Like all these like really weird things, and each time I was sort of like rearranging my studio.
It's like a home office.
It's like a home office. Yeah. But I was always like rearranging my studio to represent myself for whatever the kind of like audience was, right? Or like hiding things or like putting things out of the way so that when I'm doing my like Pilates, I wouldn't break some sculpture or something. And all of that is to say that I feel like the camera, whether it's as a form of intimacy, right? Like there I am performing for an audience in Berlin that may or may not be there. There I am on camera performing for my Pilates instructor who tells me that I need to like do this or that with my back or my legs or whatever, and I like trust her and believe her, and she's like trying to organize me and to keep me or like afloat or so I don't break down, or trying to like have conversations with my students who are going through the difficulties that they're going through, trying to get an education during a pandemic. Like all of these things are about really about screen space, right? And then becoming super tired looking at a screen and looking at myself. And all of that is facilitated by these tools that we have either like in our pocket, built into our computers, and that's before we get to things like surveillance or how I understand my body moving through space, right? Moving through the world. This video in particular, I spent a lot of time going through this idea that I've gone through a lot, where I have noticed that as a black body, black being, a black person in various places where I assume I'm being surveilled or just sort of imagine, that it has not only changed some internal sense of myself or constructed an internal sense of myself maybe, but also changes the way that I move in that space. So I sort of joke and admit that in like stores and places like that where I assume there's a camera up high someplace, I have found that I make these kind of like exaggerated motions, or like I slow down and I'm like, you know, or I put something back on the shelf really seriously. And again, all of that is with an understanding that if, you know, if not a like surveillance state, at the bare minimum, many of us are moving through places where we are constantly under the possibility of being recorded, right? And also, of course, have that ability to then also record the recording or the system, the apparatus that records us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like a strange mixture, I would say, of knowing, of being recorded somehow, but then also this kind of like voyeuristic quality of watching recordings or watching someone being observed somehow. I guess there's this fascination for, like, sometimes when you see like big photographs of the New York skyline, people start like looking into bedrooms of people and then or living spaces and so on. But like, I think that what I was intrigued by is, or what I'm still trying to understand for myself, is like what really happens if you then come here as a visitor and you look at this work that shows you life. What does it do with your attention? Because there's always this kind of, obviously, you go to a theater or to a museum where you have a live performance, there's this tension that it creates that you have to now stay and watch it for 40 minutes. Here it's different because it's somehow also like watching something on television. You know that it's live.
Right.
After you also know that it's not live anymore. So somehow it's a disappointment when you come later. It's like watching a football game where you already know the result, but you still want to watch it. I have no answer or question for that. It's just the thought that I'm somehow intrigued by.
That's cool.
Trying to figure out what life means today. Like.
Yeah, well, I mean, the way the show is set up is, at the beginning there are 3 videos that I have already made, right? And those videos, presumably at the opening, you watch them in whatever way that you want to and sort of make sense. And then there are also these days where I try to open up this idea of the live performance, which is already, you know, mediated by technology. So yes, you would come if you were so inclined, but what you would see would be not that radically different from what's happening here, although it would be just sort of projected in the other space. But I think one thing that I was interested in is, one, the kind of like problems and just what happens through mediation of technology. So the breakdowns in like sound, the glitches, even I think later on, like the branding of the live stream system that gets used. I use Vimeo, but you know, this sort of like container of something, right? What happens on my end though is, I think, I will say, like for me, always, again, in the terms of like being my own viewer, really interesting because I have to continue to look inside my own self as I'm performing. You know, like if I was just recording it, if I was unhappy or uncomfortable, or the glass broke, let's say, I could just like start over, right? But here, as it's being live streamed, even though I don't know who's in this space, I feel all this, if not pressure, this kind of like relationship being formed, right? Of just like someone looking at me. Again, like I don't know that I'm being surveilled.
Yeah, but do you want to do something?
React.
Like, do you feel the pressure of doing it all correct? Performing correctly somehow? Because if you mentioned the surveillance idea, also this idea of being a person that is surveilled, doing something wrong, stealing something, moving wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, all these kind of different videos you perform with a sheet of glass and to a moment of exhaustion, so of a moment of impossibility of continuing somehow. So there is obviously also this point of no return, or this like critical point of like, I could drop it and everyone sees it. I could do something wrong with it and everyone sees it.
Right. I mean, it's weird because it doesn't really, the breaking of the glass isn't a problem. I break the glass in one of the videos, actually, so this is sort of 2 sheets of glass in the end for these performances. I think I just mean the kind of, the relationships that are forged, one through performance. So in the last couple of years, I've had some opportunities to perform in events and things that are very much about performance. So like in New York, Performa Biennial, I've performed in, I think twice now. And sometimes during Performa, they will say to me like, oh, you know, should we ticket this event? And I'm always like, no. I like never want anyone to like, please, I don't like, if you charge people money to come into this space, I will feel a weird responsibility to entertain them. And I already have all these issues with spectacle anyway, right? And so sometimes when I'd be in my studio, even though I didn't know anyone was there, there were definitely moments where I felt like, is this enough? And that already was like a question, like enough for who and why and for what, right? Where the space that I'm trying to operate from is like, I'm pretty sure it's enough for me, right? Like I've already set out these kind of parameters and I was always trying to be the first viewer of my work. So, you know, it's like a kind of mix of things where I don't, like disappointment's not a thing that I want, but at the same time, I struggle with that, like, because I know it's very much a possibility, right? Because I think we've all trained ourselves to become consumers of various kinds of things, from, you know, artworks to education to whatever.
Like capitalist society.
Yeah, or just like everyone wants return on investment, whether that's your like, you know, subway fare or something else, right?
That maybe is a good moment to talk about another work that you presented for the first time in 2021 at the Whitney. Disturbing the View. Live performance.
Yes.
Like live, really live in person, on site, physical presence, where you performed the activity of a window cleaner, like fully equipped, cleaning the windows, only that they were like not clean afterwards. It was announced as a performance happening, but then also not really giving the kind of like stage for a performance. It just happened during the opening hours of the Whitney, of you cleaning the windows in the lobby and then later on one of the terraces.
The way it works is, so this was a project that I was invited to do a performance at the Whitney, and I wanted to make this work where essentially I would circle the building. So I started on the ground floor, and on the windows, I always say like I dirty them, and I would enter the museum and then proceed upstairs, I guess to maybe the whatever floor that is, like the 8th floor, and make my way down the outside terraces, continuing to dirty various windows of the museum. And I did this over the course of a couple of hours. I think I did the performance, I don't know, several times though. And I would just sometimes touch a window kind of briefly, and other times I would stay there for a really long time on a window, just sort of like wiping it and like removing this material from the surface of the window and then reapplying it and coming back and reapplying it, and like top windows, bottom windows. And there were people who would show up for the performance and understand it as performance, right? And sort of like wait for me to start performing. And I always found that in those moments, I was like the least interested in the project. So if I would, so say I started at like noon, and I always started at the lobby, And if you were there at the Whitney waiting for me, I would kind of like do it for a minute and then like run away from you. But what was more interesting for me was the moments where someone was like looking out the windows to check out the view or take a photo or like wave to their friend, and I would stay there forever. And every time that like you were trying to reorient yourself to take a photo, I would get in your way. And I would just go over and over and over again on the windows. And those kind of transitions of performer, quasi-worker, artwork, whatever I was like the most interested in those kinds of like transitions. There was a moment where I was on one of the downstairs set of windows, and this woman was sitting down with some of the chairs that were laid out. I just kept like moving her. I just like kept moving her away from me. And then at one point she goes, "Oh, he's doing something." And then I would like go away. Like the moment it became kind of artwork, I was like, "Oh, we're not having any kind of discussion anymore." And I would try to sort of like rearrange those kind of conversations. So I think the work, I'm interested in that mix of like the work is a performance, the work is not, the work is who knows what it is, right? But this is again sort of always me trying to understand my position as first viewer, first contact with oneself.
So it's work and labor on one hand side, but then it's also spectacle on the other?
No, I mean, the work-labor thing is interesting, and I think the project has a lot of complications and contradictions, which I am also really interested in, the way I think most makers are. The work starts, how do I talk about this? So there's an image that starts the work for me that is an important like mental reference, but not the work itself. And it's sometimes hard to talk about a reference without having the reference dictate a reading of the work. But I'll endeavor anyway. So the work starts with, for me, one, thinking about just the architecture of the museum. But the image that really set me off was the idea largely about squeegee men, which is already like kind of complicated in its racialized and gendered way. So in New York, and I'm sure many other places, but there's a kind of politics around squeegee men in New York as figures who are panhandling or asking for money, and they approach your car, let's say, and they just start cleaning your car. And there's like a really interesting and complicated history and idea around them as it relates to, I think, really conservative notions of a city falling apart that are definitely worth investigating. But one of the things beyond that I was interested in is what happens when a figure, and many different figures trigger many different reactions, but when a figure approaches your window and starts doing this labor or this action or this gesture, right? And one of the things that struck me was that when you're in your car, what's happening is less about the fact that your window is being cleaned or dirtied or anything, is that you are instantly confronted with another person. And that confrontation breaks the thing that you were trying to do, which is either like get where you're going or ignore someone or whatever. And it's like that confrontation with another being, I have found causes many of us like great difficulty, right? Like many of us, whether it's about someone cleaning your window or some other set of relationships, like we would much rather look away, right? Even if we have great intentions, think of ourselves as good people. That direct confrontation, someone says like, I know that you were like on your way to elsewhere, but like I'm right here. Yeah. I'm right here, right? And now what? And so, that's certainly true of art contexts and art spaces. And again, I have a body that when I'm in certain spaces, I think of I wonder about what it's like to be surveilled. And I wanted, in some ways, to present my body in this other way, right? Again, not as a reproduction of the figure squeegeeing, but with a kind of acknowledgement that many bodies in different ways can be an obstacle, and all of us are capable of, I think, looking away and trying to understand all these like various possibilities, right? To be the person who looks away, to be the person who causes the looking away. And I'm always interested in sort of jumping back and forth between positions.
But is the glass then in this, like the sheet of glass, the screen you're holding, is it the screen we are looking at?
Is it the screen we're looking at? I don't know. I mean, it's like, in some ways, like the glass, it's just an object to be played with, honestly, right? So like there was a relationship between the glass sheet that I'm performing with and the work that I did on the facade of the Whitney. But I think mostly I'm interested in playing with the glass with the kinds of ideas of like, what are the limits of my body, and also what are the like various ways of moving, right, with the glass. So the last performance, Y, with the glass is, I think, pretty different in a lot of ways. And I realized in performing with the glass, I just had not gone slowly with it for some reason. And so I was like, oh, I should slow down. And it definitely became kind of like the most, I would say, like intimate, like strangely erotic in its way of just sort of like touch and body. But all of those are just like references and ideas, right? And what exactly it quote unquote like means, I don't really know. But again, I feel like I'm interested in these like transitions. So the glass in the last performance, I think, becomes a body, right? And at the Whitney, sometimes I'm a performer, and sometimes I'm mistaken for someone who works there.
Which is then also like a huge political, somehow, level or layer in your work. Because it has to do with you being a person of color in the situation of cleaning the windows at the Whitney also. I
mean, I think actually, well, the confusion has to do sometimes with just like simple things, like I look official, right? And so I'm not so interested actually in the confusion of me being a worker at the Whitney, so much as I'm interested in it would turn out what happens if someone confuses me for a worker at the Whitney and I misrepresent some of these workers at the Whitney, many of whom happen to be people of color. And so as I was working, someone would ask me a question, and I'd be like, God, I'm not here to answer. Like, I don't know where the thing that you're looking for is, right? And I sort of either felt like I don't want to answer your question, or just like, please leave me, or whatever, right? And there was a moment where I realized like, oh, you have to be civil, not only because that's what you want to be, but because if you're not, anyone who would suffer from your, incivility would not be you, but would be someone who works there, right? Either just as like, that's a thing that gets said about the staff at the museum. And it wouldn't be the like curatorial staff or the director or anything, right? It would be someone who is in a position who is doing, like guard duty or maintenance duty. So like that's, again, it's like a roundabout way of thinking about it. And it comes back to my understanding of how I want to interact with the people who work there.
Like a question of feedback.
Yeah.
Somehow, which you never got here.
Nope.
Now is the chance.
Now's the chance.